Hey everyone, Maarten from QuadSpinner here, and today we have an exciting tutorial on the trees node. I think a lot of people have been waiting for this tutorial specifically because this node is super cool. However, it is also very complex when you first look at it, and there are so many controls that it can get a little overwhelming. So today we're going to discuss each slider, and then I'll show you how it works practically. And then lastly, I will actually show you how I really use it for my own project. Because yeah, you can get very creative with this node. So yeah, I'll be discussing all of it for you guys today, and hopefully you will walk away from this video knowing how to use this node properly and to its full extent, full potential. So yeah, let's get started. So before we start playing around with all these settings right here, I just want to focus on the input is of course the input, but the inhibition right here. This is a very important input because it allows us to create very custom masks, and it will mask out the trees from those areas very accurately. For now, I can show you real quick with a super simple example, and something like this. This is going to just make sure that there's no trees growing on all the steep areas right there. And if we then check it, as you can see, so we'll remove this and I'll show you again. And you can see that the trees on that area were removed super accurately. A flow mask can sometimes be very nice because yeah, you don't always get like super accurate controls when you want to have the trees growing in the flow areas but still keep some space for an actual creek or a rock flow. Then the inhibition mask will give you that control. Yeah, super recommended to use the inhibition mask. So looking at the trees node in 2.2.6, there's actually two outputs right now, which is the instances and the area mask. However, the area mask is an experimental feature currently. I will take responsibility for that one. I asked Dax to implement it so I could test it. It works, but it still needs some extra care to make the output more reliable. The instances work fine though. So first I'll just go through the instances and then let you know how the area mask option is best used if you're interested. However, if you're just looking for stable, reliable performance, use the current setting of instances. Next is the count in thousands. So this is your density for the tree simulation. Putting it higher is definitely recommended for a better mask output. However, it can get quite heavy. I normally set this to 500,000. But you could also set this to something lower. Is relative means that this will scale up with a higher resolution. I recommend keeping this turned on so you can get predictable results at higher resolutions. But beware, it can get quite heavy on like a 16K output. So in case you are running into RAM issues, you can turn this off, or you can just lower your count in thousands. Tree size is quite simple. It's the size of each little instance in height, not width. So this is not really applicable for the mask, but it can be quite useful if you're using Gaea tree output for your final shape. Trim under is a really useful way to clamp down on your trees. So this basically just removes any tree instance that's under a certain size, which with the tree simulation right now, it kind of tapers off in size. So this way you can kind of clamp down on that tapering. Shape has point, big, and big only. Point is a single small pixel. Big are bigger shapes. The big option is the preferred shape for exporting a tree mask. However, the point shape does look better when visualizing inside of Gaea. Next, we have regular seed control. So you can just change the seed, and as this is a simulation, you'll get different results. In the growth settings, we have seek water. Here we can just simply control whether the trees grow near water flows or with the avoid option away from water flows. Avoid trees is used for stacking tree nodes. This is useful when you're trying to get various masks for different species or maybe even different biomes, and you don't want them to grow through each other. So with the avoid trees option, you're basically just masking out the either previous tree node or all of the tree nodes that are in your whole stack. Health has multiple effects, as it's somewhat like the duration of the simulation. It can affect the overall density and size of the instances. But higher health also allows trees to grow further up into smaller sources of water, or in layman's terms, they will grow into smaller valleys. I would normally say that if you're trying to create a tree mask for trees growing at the base of a valley, a lower health will work around 0.3. And if you're trying to create trees that are really growing on more dangerous areas, such as steep slopes with a lot of smaller water flows, then you want the health to be a bit higher. Patches is a slightly stylized effect. It clumps trees together, so instead of individual trees growing, you get larger clumps of trees. Spread is super interesting, and the name might make you think that it simply spreads your trees, but it does not. It actually kind of blurs out the area where trees can grow, thereby spreading them out, but it also removes some of the smaller detail, as multiple small flows can clump together into one larger mass of trees instead of a bunch of small forest strips. I definitely use spread a lot. If you turn this all the way off and you don't have patches enabled either, it can look kind of weird seeing all the little forest strips growing up a hillside. So using spread, you can get more natural kind of foresty areas that are clumped together rather than very accurately following the flow of the water. The random slider just adds a random noise onto the tree mask. So what happens is that you just get trees placed all over your terrain. So we're not using this pretty much ever because they don't follow any of your aspect inhibition and they just kind of place random dots. The aspect inhibition settings. Slope is of course simple slope masking with a slope fall off. Altitude is simple height masking. Make sure you set the fall off to something lower than 1, otherwise you'll just have trees all over your terrain. Peaks simply removes the tree growth from the peaks of the mountain, so not necessarily the highest areas, but just the areas that are most exposed in a sense. And then strict is basically more accurate inhibition, but less natural, so you get a sharper fall off and it allows for less outliers. Snow inhibition. Dead flow is the amount of snow mass moving down the mountain. Consolidate flows at high amounts will group the snow into a larger mass that flows down the mountain further. Little snow consolidation gives you a bunch of smaller snow masses that don't move as far. Bias can direct the snow to flow less or more. And snowline is the height at which the snow flows start. So under the artistic control, we have the chaos setting, which is basically just warping the tree positions for a more natural look, so they don't follow the flows super straight and look a bit more randomized. Blur edges tapers the edges of the tree growth more. With trim settings enabled, it will remove more of the edge too though. Visualize data helps you see the flows, tree growth, and snow flows. I'll skip over the custom inhibitors as it's kind of like a future control that Dax will need to cover because I am not mathematically equipped. Alright, so now we're going to quickly check the area mask option, and I want to put a huge disclaimer down that this is an experimental feature that I requested to play with, and it is working, but it is not stable, and at the same time it is not working in a way that we would want it to work. The instances work perfectly. The area mask is kind of getting access to the back end of the simulation. Therefore, some of the effects that you'll get are weird, and I can explain them. So we're going to actually plug in an effects node here into the trees output so we can visualize this better. I'm just going to lock it down. And one of the things that is weird is the health, for example. So health for the normal instances simulation is the duration. So as the simulation keeps going, more and more instances spawn in. So more trees are being placed. Now, in the case of the area mask, it's actually the simulation's backend, and you'll kind of see it, where it's kind of showing where trees will grow at this current age. But then once the age has kind of passed, it turns to black again. So it's kind of interesting to visualize. So you'll see that at low health, you'll see it's all the big flow areas, main areas. And I'm actually going to bypass this one so we're not distracted by it and disconnect the inhibition. And then you can see that as we bring up this health, you can see that slowly the trees are kind of dying out in the healthy area, the most water rich area, and they're slowly moving up the mountain into these smaller little gullies and little bits up there. So it's very interesting. But this is actually what's happening with the instances as you bring up the duration. It's spawning in more trees at every step though. And in our case, nothing is staying. Nothing is actually kind of sticking around like the instances were. So we'll have to use multiple of these tree nodes if we want to use this. Secondly, the spread is very important. If you have spread set to 0, there's not much visible. Right now, I'm auto leveling it and bringing up the brightness, but I definitely recommend bringing up the spread. It will just kind of add a lot more thickness to this mask. Next up, don't use the aspect inhibition. Aspect inhibition just doesn't work well. What we'll use instead is the inhibition mask, which works perfectly. So when we have this slope right here, this mask right here, it perfectly translates into the tree mask here. As you can see, that's looking really good. Like, you can mask out areas very easily and accurately. Now, I would personally stack up a few of these nodes because you can only get one set of time. So you can only get this very early time, and then you have to get a second node to kind of get the later time stages of the trees. There we go. We got another tree node here, and yeah, with the higher age, we can see that it's moving up into the actual terrain here. We can avoid all trees. That still works. See, it's still masking out where the old trees were. I don't know if you need to do this or want to do this. You could. You get a little mask really kind of going across these smaller flow areas, and well, taking this output, combining it together, and then using a curve to kind of clamp down on it, we get this tree mask. I also want to mention that the dead flow still works. There you go. The dead flow is still working perfectly. And the artistic control, chaos and such still works. So you can actually do all of that. Just don't try to work with the aspect inhibition. It works kind of in a weird way. I think the altitude will work. Yeah, altitude will work, but slope doesn't. So you can use altitude, just don't use slope. And it's way less RAM intensive than the instances. However, again, I do want to iterate, it is experimental and it's not as reliable as the instances because that setting just works. So today we're going to be working with a gabor. So gabor is a fun little wavy texture. And yeah, we can create a bunch of cool shapes with this thing. And this is just one of many uses with this primitive. So definitely look into the gabor if you're not yet looking at it already, and try some stuff with it. In our case, we're going to height remap it a little bit and turn the size down so we get a bigger field of, well, hills here. It kind of looks like hills. And we're going to run it through a rivers node. So the rivers are just there to kind of get those valleys locked in, get the shape prepped and ready for further erosion. Then we're actually using a headwaters with 1000, a bunch of water, a bunch of down cutting. It's all just kind of heavy-handed stuff to just cut this shape and make sure that we're actually getting what we need. At this point, we're going to run it through a crumble. It's just something that Aaron Westwood showed me. It was a pretty cool trick. The crumble will kind of give you the same effect as rivers in the sense where it just targets the valleys. However, it then will create a very deep trench through this terrain. This is great to prep our terrain for some really heavy-handed erosion that we'll be doing soon. Now I'm going to warp it for some extra details because it's all quite smooth. And after this, erosion 2. So this erosion 2 node is set to a scale of 100, so it's really for a larger scale terrain. I didn't touch any of the sediment discharge settings, and I mostly just worked with the shape settings. So when I meant heavy-handed, I'm mostly looking at this shape sharpness here, and we could probably cut down even more, but honestly, it's looking good already. What I'm looking for is really just this triangular mountain shape. We're gonna transform 3D and just scale up a section of this mountain, because I don't need all of these valleys. I just chose the one that I like the most. And then I'm using a thermal shaper with an actual kind of boost on the shape here with a 0.5 boost at a scale of 75. We're just kind of bulking up this terrain again. So it's a bit more of a linear fall off rather than kind of an exponential slope. We have this linear straight slope with yeah, all kinds of cool little details. However, not enough. So we're gonna use a warp and then fractal terraces with a slope mask. So we're just getting a little bit more cliff detail on those slopes. Running through another erosion with an influence set to 0.5. And yeah, you can check the settings here. It's basic settings. We're basically doing this to just create some extra gullies, extra hydraulic erosion detail, but nothing crazy. The main shape is already there for us. And at this point, add some snow and our choke point. We're ready to add these trees. So this is a very simple build, but you know, not every mountain has to be some kind of huge hero mountain. This is a very nice little valley. Yeah, definitely a cool thing to scatter some trees on. So what we're going to be doing is really preparing this inhibition mask. So when I use the trees node, I'm very particular as to where the trees grow. I have a lot of ideas as to where there should be trees and shouldn't be. You check your reference, you see how the trees grow in the area that you're trying to kind of mimic. So yeah, you find a solution, and you don't have to do everything inside of the trees node. You can get creative with this inhibition mask. In my case, I of course get the flow here, and I use the curve to just kind of extract the, well, important ones, the bigger flows. I get this thinner flow by just getting the flow length, giving the flow length quite a high value, and then turning down the flow volume by a bunch. So we're not getting a huge amount of sediment flowing, just very small amounts, but they're going very far. Next, we're going to take a slope, And we're going to also get a height selection, which we're going to distort a little bit. And after we've gotten the right values, in my case, a slope of 40 and a height of 0.35, we're going to invert it so it's white. Next, we're going to get the color erosion and set it to the max blend mode. So we're keeping all the bright values. And we're just going to blend by 100%. And at this point, you're going to kind of fine tune whatever you need, depending on what kind of mountain range you got. We're going to just fine tune this, this flowing sediment. So I see this mostly as kind of like a rock flow, rather than this would be kind of a hydraulic flow. This is going to be our rock flow. So think of like scree debris, which is like rock debris falling down a mountain. Often areas where there's a heavy rock flow, there's not going to be any tree growth. And the reason why I like doing it with a color erosion is because it can get quite realistic flows. When you get these kind of slopes here, when they're not huge, you don't get a huge amount of rock flow, just a little bit. And you'll see in real life references too, that often the rock flow will kind of congregate a little bit below the slope and then right underneath the slope. If it's not a huge cliff face, you'll sometimes even have some tree growth right at the base of this cliff. It's very interesting. And I feel like using color erosion like this to kind of get this kind of scree mask, I guess, or debris mask is a very cool way. I used it for a rocky mountain, and it was like the perfect way to get those huge scree like screens of rock debris that the Rocky Mountains have. And yeah, it looks really nice when you use it as a inhibition mask on the trees because it works very well together. However, this mask right here is not contrasty enough, so we're using the curves to kind of cut down on it. Now you can already see, right, like we're getting a bunch of these small flows which are not super interesting, but then you also get these big rock flows that are just really flowing down and piling up at the bottom there. And yeah, the color erosion has a lot of controls, so you can really dial in that mask. Now we're just going to combine everything together. We also have dusting and snow. Combine everything together into this giant white mask, and the black areas is where trees can grow and the white areas is where it's inhibited. So I have 3 here, but it's basically all the same, just different shapes. So we're just going to start with the basic trees here with the point. So we're going to use our portal, which is right here to the choke point, as our in, and then our mask into the inhibition. So you can see the count in thousands is 500, and then the tree size is just 0.1, and then the trim under, I actually turned this up a little bit to 0.15. So we're actually kind of clamping down on some of the trees that are growing a bit more in areas where they shouldn't be, where they're a bit weak. This is going to give us a bit more of a unique shape. So I'm using the seek water, avoid trees, none, because we're not stacking anything. And the health is 0.75, very basic, small patches, and no spread. Honestly, the spread could be turned up a little bit. It might give us a little bit of an interesting shape. So I'm going to 0.25 this. So there we go. When we use the spread function, you can see that it really congregates our tree growth a lot more near those flows. They become a lot stronger over there. Okay, I think I'm liking this. This is looking good. It's really cutting down on some of those trees that are growing further away, or at least it's making them weaker. And then the trees that are growing near those big flows are getting stronger as well. Again, we can use this as the grayscale of the mask. We can use it for density, but also the scale of our scattered trees in a lot of our 3D software that we export this mask to. So yeah, very nice to have. We're not touching the random. For the aspect inhibition, again, we don't really need this because we already masked out the slopes here, but I set it to 45 and the altitude to 0.4. This is also something that is slightly used, but not much, as most trees are again being masked out by this aspect inhibition right here. So that's kind of the fun thing. Like, you have aspect inhibition controls inside of the tree node, but if you make an inhibition mask, you don't really need to play with these because you can get really precise controls with the mask and you can visualize it. So it's actually super useful. So we're not using any of that. The snow dead flow, we're using a little bit of that. So yeah, you can see that the snow dead flow, I have very low consolidation, so it's very small flows, and the bias is set quite low, so that means that it flows down the mountain even less. And this is just kind of cutting away a few trees at the top, making sure that they really don't grow in those gullies over there. And yeah, it doesn't have a huge effect, but it's all kind of small stuff working together. It has a nice effect right here where it just kind of breaks up this edge in this tree, in this little gully here in this tree patch. So yeah, it looks good. and then the chaos, I didn't touch it. Basically, that's it for these trees. And now if you want to get a mask, we'll see that the actual mask is pretty much not legible. It's very hard to see here. So what you would do realistically is turn these into big points. So what we're going to do is click on the shape here and press big. So this is going to turn the shape of the tree from a single pixel into I think maybe 9 pixels. It's going to turn the shape into a little bit bigger of a square. And then we actually get this output, which is already a lot more legible. And what we can do next is add a little bit of shaper controls here to brighten this thing up. And at this point, you can add a curve. And we can start playing with the clamping of this mask. There we go. I think this is great because again, these dark values, they're gonna be great for our scattering in Blender. For my case, could be another software in your case. And at this point, you're gonna use an export node. And I personally set it to JPEG because you don't need this to be a super high file size. This doesn't have to be 16-bit or anything. Just the 8-bit image will do, and JPEG is fine. So yeah, this is kind of how I set it up. What you could do if you want to is add a small blur. So I think this might be too high, but something like 0.01 could make your mask a little bit more natural. You could even warp this a little bit. And yeah, there's all kinds of ways. If you want to use this mask for texturing, I would definitely blur it a bit so it's not so pixelated. But this is definitely the way to get a tree mask from Gaea that's very usable. So yeah, guys, I really hope this video helped you guys with your tree node outputs and that you guys can walk away now knowing how to use this properly and really get the most out of this node. I know some people were struggling getting good masks with this node, so I'm really excited to help you guys out with this thing. Anyway, guys, it's kind of up in the air right now what the next video will be about. So if you have any suggestions, let me know in the comments. And yeah, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching.